Today we're totally decoding the numerical seals of Matthew and the wild 40th Jubilee mystery.
So, is the book of Matthew actually hiding a supernatural code? Let's crack these hidden mathematical patterns together. Matthew introduces Jesus as the Son of Man, a specific title that actually led to his rejection by Israelites.
But get this. As the very first New Testament book, Matthew consists of exactly 28 chapters.
This perfectly mirrors the Bible's literal first verse. Genesis 1:1 contains exactly 28 Hebrew letters.
Why 28? Well, mathematically speaking, it's the exact triangle number for 777.
In biblical numerology, 777 represents the triune God's total perfection, beautifully manifesting as the Word made flesh.
And the precision just continues. Matthew isn't only the first New Testament book, it's the 40th book overall.
This completely aligns with Isaiah 40 and Ezekiel 40, symbolizing Christ directly in the midst of his people.
Plus, 40 is the numerical value of the 13th Hebrew letter, which beautifully translates to ahava, or love.
Mathematically, 13 connects to the composite 37. That's a number equating directly to the name Yesu, or Jesus.
Tracing back to Genesis, 40 symbolizes God's loving struggle with wicked mankind for exactly 120 years.
Those 120 years perfectly divide into three 40 Jubilee periods. That maps out a massive 6,000-year biblical timeline.
Much like Moses wandering for 40 years, the modern church is on a 2,000-year 40th Jubilee journey.
And Christ's 40 days on earth post-resurrection perfectly prefigures this exact 2,000-year wait for his glorious return.
Section 1. The Prophecy of 33 AD. So to understand how this text mathematically arrives at the year 2030, we actually have to start our timeline right here, in 33 AD, with a quote from the book of Matthew, chapter 24, verse 2. Jesus foretells the complete and utter destruction of the Jerusalem temple. Now, for the author of our source text, this isn't just a powerful statement, it's a trigger point. It basically sets a prophetic ticking clock into motion. Everything that follows in their mathematical model traces back to the events surrounding this exact statement, treating history as this meticulously planned sequence of events. The source maps out a highly specific 7-day timeline during the Jewish month of Nisan in 33 AD. Notice the sheer precision here. We start on Nisan 10 when Jesus departs the temple. Moving forward just a day, on Nisan 11, he's judged by the religious elders. By Nisan 14, the crucifixion takes place. And finally, on Nisan 17, the text notes a resurrection in a heavenly body. We're slowing down to look at these dates because, well, this sequence isn't just viewed as history in our text. It's treated as a rigid mathematical formula. Every single one of these days is counted and categorized as a fundamental building block for the author's larger chronological theory. So, the absolutely crucial point here is why those specific days matter so much. The source explicitly claims that these 7 literal days in 33 AD represent 7 end times prophetic years. The text draws a direct parallel to another ancient prophecy found in Daniel 9:27. And this brings us to a really vital concept in prophetic chronology, the day for year principle. It's exactly what it sounds like. The idea that a literal single day in ancient history acts as a scale model for an entire literal year in the distant future. It's a foundational mechanic for how this source works. Without this scale model, the massive leaps in time we're about to take, they wouldn't even be possible within this framework. Section 2. The Shadow of 70 AD. 37 years after the events of 33 AD, the timeline hits a catastrophic milestone. But to truly grasp its role here, we need to define a term used heavily throughout the text, shadow. In the context of this explainer, a shadow is a historical event that acts as a prophetic foreshadowing for a future end-time event. The source argues that the physical destruction of the Jerusalem temple in 70 AD is really just a shadow. So what exactly is it a shadow of? Well, the text calls it a future, wicked, spiritual temple destruction reserved for those who bear the mark of the beast on the final day of the Lord. The source firmly anchors this tragedy in ancient scripture, specifically pulling from Daniel 9:26. When the Romans laid siege and destroyed the city and the holy sanctuary in 70 AD, the text views this with a profound sense of destiny. It's not seen as just random ancient history or some geopolitical consequence, but as the exact, precise fulfillment of Daniel's blueprint regarding the people of the prince that shall come. It's a devastating historical event that the source insists is destined to literally repeat itself on a much, much grander scale. The framing of 70 AD in our source material is incredibly severe, and it's important to grasp why this matters so much to the timeline. It doesn't just call 70 AD a bad year. The text describes it as the most terrible year in human history since the Great Flood in Noah's era. Think about the incredible weight of that comparison for a second. It categorizes 70 AD as a definitive, unparalleled year of judgment. By elevating the destruction to the level of Noah's flood, the author is basically signaling to the reader that the future event it foreshadows, that final day of the Lord, will be equally unprecedented. Section 3. Biblical Math to 2030. Now, what's really interesting about this is how we shift from historical events to pure, hard mathematics. Before we get into the specific formulas, let's look at the complete visual map the source has built to bridge the ancient world to the year 2030. We start our journey all the way back at the total collapse of Israel in 701 BC. From there, we jump centuries ahead to the beginning of Jesus' prophetic reign in 30 AD, followed closely by the crucifixion in 33 AD. Then we hit that shadow event we just talked about, the devastating fall of the temple in 70 AD. And finally, the timeline stretches all the way across the centuries, projecting into the future to land right on 2030 AD. Let's look at the exact math used to bridge that massive gap. The first major calculation relies on a very specific number, 1,960. The author argues that this isn't just some random figure pulled out of thin air, but rather the exact mathematical bridge linking the shadow event of 70 AD to our ultimate target year of 2030 AD. But, where does this specific number even come from, and how is it calculated? Here's the specific formula the author uses. The text pulls directly from the book of Ezekiel 4:6, referencing an instruction to lie on the right side for 40 days as a symbol of bearing judgment. It takes those 40 days and multiplies them by a jubilee cycle. Now, in ancient tradition, a jubilee represents a period of restoration, mathematically calculated as 7 times 7, or 49. So you take the 40 days of judgment, multiply it by the jubilee of 49, and that equals exactly 1,960 years. When you take that 1,960 years and add it to our shadow starting point of 70 AD, boom, it lands squarely on 2030 AD. But, as we all know, any good mathematical model seeks verification. A single formula could just be a coincidence, right? So, to prove its own timeline and demonstrate that history is operating on a fixed cyclical schedule, the source introduces a completely separate numerical bridge, 2,730 years. This second path uses a totally different historical origin and a completely different scriptural equation. Pulling this time from Ezekiel 4:5, we get a mentioned period of 390 years. The text takes this 390 and multiplies it by a sabbatical cycle of 7, which traditionally represents a cycle of rest and release. So, 390 multiplied by 7 gives us a total of 2,730 years. If you start from the total collapse of Israel way back in 701 BC and you count forward exactly 2,730 years, this entirely different formula lands us perfectly, once again, on the exact year of 2030 AD. And this brilliantly illustrates the core argument of the source material. Just look at the convergence here. We have two entirely distinct historical origins, 70 AD and 701 BC. We're utilizing two totally different scriptural prophecies from Ezekiel. And we're applying two entirely different mathematical multipliers, the 49-year Jubilee cycle and the 7-year sabbatical cycle. Yet, both of these independent mathematical paths converge on the exact same destination, 2030 AD. For the author, this isn't viewed as a coincidence. It's presented as absolute mathematical proof of a carefully designed timeline. Section 4, the final parallels. Let's see how all of this builds to our conclusion. Now that we understand the math, what does this destination of 2030 actually mean for the author? The text draws a direct mirror image between the first century and the near future. In 30 AD, the text notes the beginning of a 3.5-year prophetic reign that ultimately ended with the crucifixion in 33 AD. Because the source views history as a recurring cycle, 2030 isn't just a date on the calendar, it's framed as the mathematically predetermined parallel to 30 AD. It's viewed as the definitive beginning of the final prophetic timeline. In Matthew 24:3, the disciples ask Jesus, "Tell us, when shall these things be, and what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world?" Now, according to the source text, they asked this because they were actually missing a crucial detail. They didn't realize that the 6,000-year era of the carnal world was eventually going to end. That one fundamental misunderstanding basically sets the stage for everything that follows. To make sense of all this, here is our roadmap for today. Number 1, the disciples' prophetic questions. Number 2, 33 AD and the seals. 3, the red and black horses. 4, the pale horse era. And finally, number 5, the Jezebel parallel. Section 1, the disciples' prophetic questions. Okay, if there is one thing you absolutely have to grasp to understand the logic of this source material, it's this concept: typology. Basically, it's a method of interpretation where a past historical event serves as a literal blueprint or a symbol for a future event. In this framework, history isn't just a series of random occurrences. No, it's a repeating pattern where earlier events directly forecast later, much larger ones. Keep this definition in the back of your mind, because honestly, it's the engine driving this entire timeline. So here's what typology looks like in action. The text asserts that the literal destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD was not just some isolated ancient tragedy. Far from it. In this framework, it's actually a direct divine message foreshadowing the destruction of the wicked world at the end of times. The local event serves as the blueprint for the global final event. In other words, those questions the disciples asked about the end of the world, they were answered through the localized destruction of Jerusalem. Section 2, 33 AD, and the seals. The absolute crucial spark that ignites this entire prophetic timeline is the year 33 AD. Here's how rapid this blueprint is. On Nisan 14, the crucifixion occurs, which is described as the slaughter of the lamb that officially opens the 7 seals. Just 3 days later, Nisan 17, is the resurrection, and exactly 50 days after that is Pentecost. According to our source, this exact rapid-fire sequence of events gives birth to the 7 churches. Right in 33 AD, the journey of the 7 seals begins, and it directly parallels the birth of the 7 churches. The very first seal introduces the white horse era. The text maps this white horse directly to the first congregation, known as Ephesus. And what's really fascinating here is what the white horse actually symbolizes in this interpretation. The source states it represents the deceptions that accompanied the journey of the congregations right from the very start, back when the apostles were first preaching the gospel to the corners of the earth. So the timeline has officially started. Section 3, the red and black horses. Moving forward from 33 AD, we hit 70 AD, and the color shifts to red. This is paired with the second congregation, Smyrna, and anchored historically to the Roman war. Then, the timeline jumps to 312 AD. The horse becomes black, mapped to the third congregation, Pergamos. And the historical anchor here, it's Emperor Constantine adopting pagan traditions into the church. You kind of start to see a pattern, right? Notice how systematically specific historical milestones are connected to these distinct, dramatically colored horses. Now, zooming in on that red horse era in 70 AD for a second, it was a brutal time of war and the tragic massacre of the Jewish people. The text notes the fierce persecution of the Smyrna congregation by the Romans, who are boldly identified here as the fourth beast, and the complete razing of the Jerusalem temple. But why does this specific event matter so much? Because framing the temple's destruction this way presents it as a literal fulfillment of the decline predicted back in Matthew 24. It is the exact typology we discussed earlier, playing out in real time. Section 4, the Pale Horse Era. All right, so the timeline jumps forward yet again, bringing us to the year 538 AD. And this marks the arrival of the Pale Horse. The text links this pale horse to the fourth congregation, Thyatira. While the previous horses represented things like deception, war, and the blending of pagan traditions, the pale horse represents something much, much darker, according to the source: spiritual death. The year 538 AD marks a truly massive shift in the author's chronological map. Section 5, the Jezebel parallel. Now here's how this really crucial parallel functions. In literal Old Testament history, King Ahab unites with a woman named Jezebel, which ended up plunging the Israelites into idolatry. Well, applying our spiritual typology to the era of 538 AD, the text argues that the fourth church, Thyatira, united with the spirit of Jezebel, and they also fell deeply into idolatry. The literal ancient history maps absolutely flawlessly onto the spiritual state of the medieval church. Okay, we have a vital number to talk about here: 3.5. Why is this so important? Well, going back to that literal history for a moment, because Ahab and Jezebel led Israel into idolatry, the text notes that God shut up the heavens. The result? A literal drought in Israel that lasted exactly 3.5 years. Keep that 3.5 in your head because it is literally the mathematical key to the entire next phase of the timeline. This is where the prophetic math gets pretty intense. The 3.5 years of literal drought in Israel is converted by the text into 3.5 times. In this specific formula, that translates to a massive 1,260-year historical span. And what fills those 1,260 years? The text maps this exact duration to the reign of the papacy, stretching all the way from the Pale Horse's emergence in 538 AD directly to 1798 AD. 1,260 years. Just to put the sheer scale of that number into perspective, the text maps the Pale Horse era of spiritual death over an entire millennium and then some. It perfectly stitches a literal 3.5-year drought in the ancient past to a 1,260-year span of modern history, tightly locking the events of 538 AD to the geopolitical landscape of 1798 AD. It's a staggering jump. Which leaves us with one final, totally fascinating thought. We've just seen how this source uses typology and prophetic math to construct a highly specific timeline from the year 33 AD all the way to 1798 AD. So if this text maps over 1,700 years of history with such structured precision, what event does it point to next? When the 1,260 years ended in 1798, what horse or what era emerged to take its place? Take heed that no man deceive you, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. So the author frames their entire historical analysis around this one single concept of an ultimate, world-ending deception. We aren't just talking about politicians telling a few lies here. The text points to a systemic, global hijacking of truth. According to the source, Jesus' warning sets the stage for a grand imposter, someone or something that steps into the absolute highest role of spiritual authority to lead the masses astray. The text actually traces the origins of this grand deception back to the fourth biblical congregation, which is known as Thyatira. According to the source, this era was heavily influenced by a Jezebel figure, dragging the masses down into idolatry and blasphemy. It's wild because the author draws a direct parallel between this congregation and the fourth seal in the book of Revelation, the pale horse representing spiritual death. And it's exactly from this era of spiritual death, the text claims, that a literal man of sin emerges. This figure supposedly elevates himself way above God, actually claiming the Messiah's unique power to forgive human sins. Moving on to Section 2, Decoding the Beast's Identity. Having established that spiritual environment of deception, the source text now acts as a literal decoder ring for the incredibly dense symbolism found in the book of Revelation. What's truly striking is how directly the author maps these mind-bending apocalyptic symbols to tangible, real-world political entities. When Revelation 13 speaks of a beast rising out of the sea, well, the text decodes the sea as the continent of Europe, the beast itself, interpreted as the papacy, operating as a predatory world superpower back in the Middle Ages. The dragon granting power to this beast is identified as the devil, and those 10 crowns are decoded as 10 European secular kingdoms spanning from the 1800s all the way to the last days. It is a highly precise one-to-one mapping of prophecy to geopolitics. And speaking of those crowns, the number 10 is absolutely crucial in this framework. According to the source, this number also represents the 10 horns of a terrifying beast described over in Daniel chapter 7. The author identifies these 10 horns as the fragmented European nations that basically emerged from the ashes of the Roman Empire right around the year 476 AD. And it's out of this totally chaotic political landscape that the ruling power was said to arise. This perfectly illustrates the text's central claim about the true nature of that power. Revelation 13 describes this terrifying animal mashup, right? A beast like a leopard with the feet of a bear and the mouth of a lion. The source material interprets these specific animals as predator symbols. By connecting this imagery to the papacy, the author is framing this historical institution as a literal human predator during the medieval ages, a superpower wielding absolute total authority over its domain. That brings us to Section 3, the 1260-year prophetic timeline. Having boldly established the who and the where, the explainer now shifts focus to the when. And this relies on some highly specific and frankly fascinating prophetic math. The text takes a specific phrase from Revelation 13:5, which states, "The beast was given power to continue for 42 months." Now, in this style of prophetic interpretation, a day often equals a year. So if you take 42 months of 30 days each, you get 1,260 prophetic days. The source material takes that and converts it directly into a sweeping historical epic of exactly 1,260 actual years. 1,260. This is not just a rough estimate in the source material, it is the exact, unyielding number of years the author claims this dominant predatory power structure reigns supreme over the European continent. We're talking about a massive, uninterrupted block of human history defined entirely by this singular authority. If we plot this out, we can visually see the author's historical framework. The text anchors the absolute start of this 1,260-year reign in the year 538 AD. Now, do the math. If you add exactly 1,260 years to 538 AD, it brings you precisely to the year 1798. According to the source, this marks the absolute beginning and the definitive end of this specific phase of prophetic history.
Which leads us to Section 4, the deadly wound is healed.
But of course, history didn't just stop in 1798, and according to the source, neither did the prophecy. The year 1798 was not the permanent end of this power. Revelation 13 verse 3 speaks of a head of the beast being wounded to death, but then, miraculously, the deadly wound was healed. The text interprets this biblical deadly wound as a very real documented historical event, the French military, under Napoleon, taking the Pope prisoner in exactly 1798, which effectively broke its political power. But what about the healing? Well, the author maps that healing directly onto the 1929 Lateran Treaty. That was the treaty that officially recognized Vatican City as an independent state, legally restoring the political power of the papacy.
Expanding our timeline out, we see exactly how this source aligns these ancient verses with major modern geopolitical milestones. You have the 538 AD start, this 1798 deadly wound administered by Napoleon right on prophetic schedule, and then the 1929 healing via the Lateran Treaty. It's essentially an unbroken thread connecting ancient apocalyptic visions straight into the 20th century.
And that brings us to our final part, Section 5, the final global superpower.
For this final section, the author connects all of this medieval European history directly to our modern day. They do this by tracing a lineage of biblical church congregations, moving us from the distant past right into the crucible of end-time prophecy. Let's trace how this evolves. We started with the fourth congregation, Thyatira, which the text says initiated a spiritual death that continues all the way to the end times. Out of that era, the fifth congregation, Sardis, is born. The author explicitly identifies this with Martin Luther separating from the established church in 1517, matching it up with the opening of the fifth seal. And from Sardis comes the sixth congregation, Philadelphia, running parallel to the sixth seal, which represents the rise of the modern era. Now here is where the source brings its decoding right to our modern doorstep. It concludes by definitively identifying this sixth congregation, Philadelphia, as the United States of America. But in this text's framework, this isn't exactly a complimentary designation. Correlating with the opening of the sixth seal, the USA is cast by the author as the ultimate world superpower that actually acts as a creator of global end-time chaos and wars. It frames the modern geopolitical dominance of the United States not as a triumph, but as the final, incredibly turbulent stage in this ancient prophetic countdown.
Ultimately, what we're left with is a profound question. How does viewing history through the lens of ancient prophecy change the way we perceive modern global powers? Regardless of your personal worldview, understanding this eschatological framework provides a really fascinating look at how ancient texts are still being utilized today to decode the modern world.
On this passage from Matthew 24 verses 6 and 7, quote, "And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that ye be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom." In biblical scholarship, this is known as the Olivet Discourse. The author explicitly draws parallel connections between this verse alongside Luke 21:10-11 and current world events. To the author, this isn't just historical poetry. It's an active, living checklist that our current generation is supposedly ticking off one by one.
But before we go any further, we really need to define a crucial term the author uses over and over again, the carnal age completion. According to the text, this is the ultimate fulfillment of prophetic signs and calamities leading up to the end of the current earthly era. And we have to emphasize the gravity of the word carnal in this context.
Carnal refers to the flesh, the physical, tangible world as we know it. By defining this, we understand the stakes here are literal, physical finality, not just a spiritual metaphor. These signs aren't just isolated pieces of bad news. They are presented as the required structural steps leading to the actual close of human history.
Section 2, Global Conflicts and Wars. That brings us to the author's first major category of evidence, what the text calls Sign 1. This section is strictly focused on geopolitical warfare in the actions of modern superpowers.
And here is where the text starts mapping ancient words directly onto modern maps. We've got the ancient prophecy, nation shall rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, paired right up against the author's modern interpretations. The text explicitly links this verse to the 2022 Ukraine war, seeing it as a direct fulfillment. But the author doesn't just look backward. They take a massive risk by predicting the future, claiming this prophecy points to a highly specific, looming conflict in 2026 involving the US, Israel, and Iran. That level of specificity is exactly what makes this document so uniquely bold.
And this brilliantly illustrates the mechanics of the author's warning. The text outlines 4 specific, compounding threats tied to these global conflicts: the potential for wider global conflicts, the dangerous threat of multi-front warfare, a looming nuclear deterrence crisis, and deep economic and supply chain warfare. The author is suggesting that these aren't just isolated regional border disputes. No, they are a cascading, interconnected system of global destabilization. Think about the supply chain issues or the inflation you felt recently at the grocery store. The author frames those everyday struggles as direct symptoms of this massive geopolitical threat.
The text then takes a dramatic theological turn. It concludes that these human-driven global conflicts are actually described as the deed of the devil. Citing Revelation 16:14-16, the source asserts that the underlying purpose of all this geopolitical tension is to intentionally gather all the world's nuclear superpowers and the kings of the earth to a singular prophesied destination, the battle of the great day of God Almighty, widely known as Armageddon.
Section 3. Famine, earthquakes, and calamities. Let's move to the next section and see how this builds, shifting from human-made geopolitical wars to earthly and economic disasters, which the source labels as signs.
Take a look at this striking number, 135 million. In any context, that number is absolutely staggering. It's almost hard to wrap your head around. But the author uses this specific figure not just to quantify a modern tragedy, but as a rigid prophetic metric to prove their larger point. The source elaborates that this 135 million represents real people across 55 different countries who have been experiencing acute food insecurity since 2019. What's vital here is how the text links an ancient prophetic concept like famine directly to our highly modern, interconnected world. The author states this famine is a direct result of the worldwide economic and supply chain collapse triggered by COVID-19. So it's an interpretation of ancient prophecy playing out strictly through the mechanics of 21st century globalization.
Alongside famine, the text briefly categorizes other physical calamities fulfilling these ancient warnings. It lists great earthquakes increasing worldwide, fearful sights expanding, and destructive calamities escalating globally. Now, interestingly, geologists will tell you that the actual frequency of earthquakes hasn't historically increased, but our awareness and our technological tracking of them has absolutely skyrocketed. But in the author's framework, this perceived escalation is the Earth itself reacting, providing physical, measurable data points that align perfectly with their scriptural checklist.
Section 4. The 6-year pestilence cycle. This brings us to what is perhaps the most mathematically specific claim made in the entire source document.
Now, what's really interesting about this is the framework itself. The author doesn't just vaguely say diseases will happen at some point. They outline a strict, precise mathematical pattern. The text claims that major global pestilences are operating on a predetermined cyclical timeline, hitting humanity exactly every 6 years, like clockwork.
Let's walk through the timeline the author provides to back this up. Starting in 2002, the text points to the SARS outbreak. Exactly 6 years later, in 2008, we see swine flu. Another 6 years brings us to 2014 and the Ebola crisis. Add 6 more years, and we arrive at 2020 with the devastating COVID pandemic. Biology is inherently chaotic, right? Yet the author is imposing this rigid mathematical grid right over it. Following this strict formula, they project that the year 2026 will bring the next major cycle, specifically predicting a global hantavirus outbreak. Section 5. Signs from the heavens. Having covered earthly, economic, and biological crises, we transition to Sign F. Here, the text instructs us to look upward, focusing entirely on celestial signs.
The scriptural foundation the author uses for analyzing astronomical events comes straight from the book of Joel, chapter 2, verse 31. Listen to this imagery. The sun shall be turned into darkness, and the moon into blood, before the great and the terrible day of the Lord come. This deeply dramatic imagery of solar darkness and blood moons is central to the author's final timeline.
The text then contrasts this biblical concept, specifically referencing the sixth seal and its associated solar and lunar eclipses, with our modern era. If you remember the intense media frenzy around blood moons a decade ago, this is exactly what the author is tapping into. They track a specific astronomical time frame pointing to the blood moon seasons that occurred in 2014 and 2015 and assert that this celestial season of signs continues right up through the end of the year 2027. Once again, an ancient text is overlaid onto a very specific, modern, multi-year calendar.
Section 6. The Carnal Age Completion. Finally, we reach the conclusion of the source document, where the text synthesizes all of these disparate global, earthly, biological, and celestial signs into one overarching thesis.
So the crucial point is this quote from Matthew 24:8. All these are the beginning of sorrows. The author makes it very clear that they do not see any of the events we've discussed, the wars, the 135 million facing famine, the 6-year virus cycles, or the eclipses, as random occurrences. Instead, they are the documented beginning of sorrows. It's a technical term they're utilizing, meaning this isn't the grand finale just yet, it is merely the scripted prologue to the main event.
To summarize the source's primary argument, this document acts as a meticulous blueprint. It argues that every single global war, every earthly calamity, the rigid mathematical pestilence cycle, and the celestial eclipses all act collectively as directional signs. They are all pointing humanity inevitably toward the prophesied endpoint known as the Day of the Lord and the completion of the carnal age. It's a worldview where absolutely nothing is random. Literally every single headline is a milestone.
The crucial point is that this 70-80 foundation is built on 3 distinct, undeniable pillars. You've got the persecution of the righteous, the physical destruction of Jerusalem, and the spiritual end of the Old Covenant age. Grasping this side of the parallel is absolutely essential for us right now, mostly because the source material uses this exact 3-part sequence as the launchpad for what it proposes is coming in the future.
Let's move to Section 3 and see how this builds. The End Times Parallel. The Future Mirror. All right, so we are now shifting from the ancient past and leaping directly into the proposed end times. Notice the deliberate symmetry the text uses here. We have the historical anchor, that localized persecution of the righteous, and mapped directly onto it is the end times parallel, the persecution of believers worldwide. It dramatically expands the scope. And this brilliantly illustrates the huge escalation the author is plotting. The localized end of the Old Covenant age in 70 AD is perfectly mapped onto the future collapse of the present carnal age. The blueprint is basically suggesting that just as the ancient historical age ended with the fall of a city, our current carnal age will undergo a similar, but vastly more total collapse. And, well, this escalation leads us directly into what the source emphatically describes as a global spiritual tribulation. Let's focus purely on the author's specific use of the words global and spiritual for a second. You can see exactly how the text amplifies the scale, right? It's taking the physical, localized tribulation from first century Judea and projecting it outwards as a worldwide spiritual phenomenon. But here's the thing. According to the text, this global collapse and spiritual tribulation isn't just chaos without a purpose. Impartially speaking, the source structures this worldwide upheaval as a direct, necessary transitional phase. It's entirely framed as a preparation for the kingdom of Christ. Think of the tribulation as the heavy lifting required to literally pave the way for this ultimate kingdom. Let's bring this entire framework together so you can visualize it. If we look at our core categories, persecution, societal event, and era transition, and follow the historical 70 AD anchors directly across, they map flawlessly onto the end times column. It meticulously proves how systematically the text uses the past as a direct, comparative foreshadow for the future.
It all starts with Matthew 24:10. This ancient prophecy outlines a really stark progression of global decay. Notice how this collapse actually starts small. It predicts the total shattering of our closest human bonds.
It's deeply personal, right? Friends betraying friends, communities splitting, and hatred spreading like wildfire.
So a brutal chain reaction kicks off. Fear drives us apart, causing people to reject truth entirely.
But why abandon the truth? The text points to primal motives, pure survival, politics, or personal gain.
This isn't just bad behavior. It's rooted in deep spiritual confusion and a profound moral collapse.
Losing that anchor of love creates huge vulnerabilities, really setting the stage for a massive, macro-level collapse.
Zooming out, that personal decay acts like dominoes, triggering massive, systemic, and psychological crises worldwide.
On a systemic level, the text warns this breakdown leads straight to violence and widespread global conflict.
And alongside those physical wars, financial structures are prophesied to just crumble, bringing total economic collapse.
Socially, things get worse. Vulnerable groups face severe persecution as worldwide division reaches an absolute boiling point.
Psychologically, it gets crazy. Objective truth is completely replaced by rampant, unchecked deception everywhere.
And permeating literally every single one of these escalating disasters is a gripping, inescapable global fear.
These elements combine super fast, plunging humanity into total social division and profound spiritual darkness.
But get this, the chaos isn't random. The text frames it as preparation for an ultimate conclusion. The culmination of this entire escalating timeline is a massive theological event, the second coming of Christ.
So, when looking at biblical end times prophecies, what's the absolute biggest warning sign?
You know, we usually expect things like war or famine, right? But actually, nope. The source material shows the real answer is hidden right inside the Olivet prophecy.
Specifically, Matthew chapter 24, verse 11, warns about false prophets rising up to deceive.
And catch this, the text says, many deceivers. We're not just talking about a handful.
We're talking a massive worldwide surge of totally counterfeit movements and fake divine messengers.
But here's the kicker. The real danger actually isn't open unbelief or straight-up atheism.
The far greater threat? It's pure deception, cleverly disguised as absolute truth.
The second half of this prophecy focuses entirely on the terrifying result, mass deception.
The text claims this sneaks right into religion through false doctrines and completely counterfeit gospels. Plus, it bleeds into everyday spirituality too, with totally fake signs and deceptive experiences.
So yeah, physical destruction literally pales in comparison to this kind of global spiritual threat.
The core takeaway is undeniable. Worldwide spiritual deception is the paramount end times warning sign.
Okay, let's dive into this. Just look around. It's obvious that global conflicts and disputes are totally skyrocketing today.
The source actually routes all this modern tension straight into an ancient biblical prophecy from Matthew 24:12. According to the text, Jesus predicted this massive surge in iniquity as a major characteristic of the end times. Now, what's really interesting about this is how the text defines iniquity as a deep, profound moral failing. It practically looks like lawlessness, totally rejecting divine principles, deep moral corruption, and intense, deep-rooted selfishness. Throw in rising violence, widespread deception, and systemic injustice, and you've got a seriously devastating societal mix. So, the crucial point is the direct consequence of all this. The love of many will literally grow cold.
This perfectly captures the profound cause and effect equation that sits right at the heart of this whole theological framework.
The source argues this crisis is way deeper than just your standard political or national disputes. It actually frames these global events as an intense, personal test of your faith, love, and loyalty. Let's move to and see how this builds. Faced with this massive test, humanity splits down two different paths. The text warns that the masses will react negatively, falling away, getting completely offended, and just growing cold. But in sharp contrast, the faithful are explicitly called to endure, stand completely firm, and grip the truth. They have to actively push forward in faith, persevering straight through even the heaviest of tribulations. The ultimate solution is found in Matthew 24:13. Whoever endures to the very end will be saved. It all starts with Matthew 24:14. It basically predicts the gospel must reach every nation before the end.
Crazy enough, 19th century believers actually saw the US as the ultimate launchpad for this final global message. But the whole timeline hinged on Daniel's cryptic question: when exactly would the sanctuary be cleansed? Daniel chapter 8 gives a super specific time frame. It essentially sets a divine prophetic clock ticking. 2,300 days. Using the rule where a prophetic day equals a year, massive calculations began. So, what's the starting gun? Ezra's historical decree to rebuild Jerusalem's temple way back in 457 BCE. If you do the math, mapping exactly 2,300 years forward from 457 BCE lands squarely in 1844. Suddenly, this obscure ancient text transforms into a totally urgent, modern countdown for 19th century America. 1844 arrives. The world doesn't end, but it absolutely sparks the explosive Second Great Spiritual Awakening. Believers realized the cleansing was heavenly, not earthly. This massive spiritual fervor birthed entirely new denominations.
The abomination of desolation.
Before we get to the heavy math, we absolutely have to know what this term actually means. The abomination of desolation isn't just some vague metaphor in this text. It refers specifically to a concrete historical event. It's the literal cessation or the stopping of the daily sacrificial offerings in the Jerusalem temple. For the author of this document, this specific disruption acts as the starting gun for a massive historical countdown.
And we've got to go way back for this. The timeline plants its flag thousands of years ago, specifically in the year 605 BCE. The text notes that this historical desolation was brought about by the king of Babylon, who, according to the author, was actually operating under the authority of the devil to halt these sacred practices. This specific year, 605 BCE, becomes the absolute bedrock for all the calculations that follow.
Fast forward a few centuries, and the source brings in the Gospel of Matthew, specifically chapter 24, verse 15. The scripture speaks of this very desolation, originally prophesied by Daniel, standing in the holy place once again. The author emphasizes this verse to show that the stopping of sacrifices wasn't just a one-time event back in Babylon. No. It's a repeating pattern, a recurring prophetic marker.
The author then ties that biblical warning straight to another massive historical moment, General Titus stopping the temple sacrifices in the year 70 AD. The text views Titus as acting under that exact same dark authority to stop the daily offerings. So we've got our ancient pattern established, right? A major disruption of sacred temple practices that serves as a giant signpost. Keep that in the back of your mind as we bring in the numbers.
Which brings us to Section 2, Unlocking the Mathematical Timeline. This is where the puzzle really starts coming together.
Now here's where it gets really interesting. The text brings in the book of Daniel, chapter 12, verse 11, which explicitly links the taking away of the daily sacrifice to a countdown. The verse concludes, "There shall be 1,290 days." So, boom, we have our first highly specific prophetic interval.
1,290. That's the crucial number here. But, and this is a huge but, how does the source interpret it? It's a big leap for an everyday reader, but in many of these end times frameworks, days are calculated as literal years in human history. So the text asks us to look not at 1,290 days, but a massive span of 1,290 years.
Let's do the math exactly the way the author lays it out. You take that starting date of the Babylonian desolation we established earlier, 605 BCE, and you add that 1,290-year prophetic interval. You run those numbers, and it lands squarely on 685 AD. And what's the historical significance of that exact date? That is the establishment of the Dome of the Rock on Mount Moriah in Jerusalem. The math directly connects an ancient Babylonian event to a major 7th century architectural and religious milestone.
And just to add another layer of complexity to this puzzle, the text briefly introduces something that calls the creation triangle. The author points out that the span of time from 685 AD up to the year 2017 serves as the exact center point of this Genesis 1:1 triangle, which is associated with the number 2701. It's a surprising, super deep dive that just shows how incredibly interwoven mathematical numerology is within the source's overall framework.
But wait, the countdown doesn't stop there. The mystery continues right into the very next verses in Daniel chapter 12. The scripture says, "Blessed is he that waiteth, and cometh to the 1,335 days." Just like that, a second, entirely separate prophetic interval enters the equation.
So now we've got a second specific number, 1,335 days. And sticking to the established formula of the text, we convert those days into another massive block of literal years. The question is,
Where does this new countdown begin?
Watch how all of this builds. Step 1. The author takes that calculated anchor year of 685 AD. Step 2. They add this new interval of 1335 prophetic years. Step 3. It mathematically pinpoints the exact modern year of 2020. Seriously, two separate ancient prophecies, layered on top of historical dates, bridge the gap from 605 BCE all the way to a year we all remember vividly.
Moving into Section 3, the 2020 prophetic convergence. This is the moment where ancient math collides head-on with modern reality. The text aligns the prophetic warnings found in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke directly against the really harsh realities that struck the entire globe in 2020.
I mean, we all remember the chaos of 2020, right? Well, according to the text, the fulfillment of these specific gospel prophecies manifested as a massive convergence of events. We're talking global conflicts, the sudden worldwide coronavirus pandemic, and great earthquakes all happening at once. For the author, that global standstill wasn't a coincidence or just a string of bad luck. It was the exact mathematical destination they had just calculated. To really drive the point home, the author connects these 2020 earthly events to the calamitous sixth seal described in the book of Revelation. The verse mentions a great earthquake, the sun becoming black, and the moon becoming as blood. The author argues that this wasn't just happening on the ground, we actually have to look up. And that takes us to our final part, Section 4, Celestial Signs and Blood Moons. The source text shifts our gaze upwards to complete this vast prophetic puzzle. It focuses on a very specific pattern in the sky, a sequence of solar eclipses, lunar eclipses, and what are known as blood moon seasons. According to this framework, these aren't just random astronomical events. They are literal visual markers of the timeline pointing right toward the completion of the current age.
And to anchor this celestial argument in the ancient texts, the author turns to the book of Joel, chapter 2, verse 31. This scripture explicitly links the darkened sun and the blood moon directly to the coming day of the Lord. By connecting Revelation and Joel, the text argues that these modern eclipses are the literal fulfillment of those ancient warnings.
So, the timeline concludes by framing our current era, specifically the years between 2014 and 2027, as a highly concentrated prophetic season defined by these exact celestial patterns. Notice those dates. According to the text, we are living right in the middle of this incredibly pivotal, transformative window of time.
The prophetic shadow.
All right, so the source uses this concept called a prophetic shadow to link that ancient physical escape to a profound spiritual condition. Basically, it takes a known historical event, like the righteous fleeing right before the catastrophic destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, and positions it as a direct foreshadowing of a future reality. Specifically, it represents God's people literally leaving a life of wickedness behind before the final world-ending tribulation hits. So the physical event perfectly mirrors the spiritual one.
Section 2. Fleeing to the mountains. The source kicks off its analysis with Matthew chapter 24, verse 16. It's this frantic command for immediate physical evacuation. Just imagine the sheer panic here. You're being told to drop absolutely everything. No packing, no second thoughts, and literally run for the hills to save your life from an invading army. Now think about the literal historical action happening here, fleeing into the mountains to escape physical destruction. Well, the source argues this perfectly mirrors a spiritual interpretation. That historical, desperate escape is actually a direct metaphor for the spiritual act of abandoning a life of wickedness. The immediate physical danger of an invading army, that directly parallels the spiritual danger of staying in a wicked state. It's a really powerful analogy.
Section 3. The danger of turning back.
These next couple of verses vividly describe a flight that is so intensely urgent you can't even pause for a second to grab basic survival gear from your house or your field. It says if you're up on the roof, don't even step foot inside your house. If you're out working in the field, absolutely do not go back to get your coat.
The absolute crucial point here is the continuous forward momentum you need to survive. Step by step, the text is reinforcing that hesitation is, quite literally, a matter of life and death. You have to keep moving forward. Whatever you do not look back at what you're leaving behind.
Bringing it back to the source's prophetic shadow framework, this strict physical rule maps perfectly onto a spiritual one. Leaving your physical belongings behind in the dirt parallels the spiritual act of never turning back to your old wicked life after being born again.
The source is arguing that once you make that critical decision to escape your old life, you have to completely sever all ties. The intense urgency of the physical escape demands that exact same absolute commitment in your spiritual journey.
Section 4. The urgency of timing.
Okay, so the text here issues a really heavy woe about physical vulnerabilities or timing issues that could tragically slow down an escape. Think about a freezing, harsh winter or the travel restrictions of a Sabbath day, because remember, ancient law strictly limited how far you could legally walk on the Sabbath. Or imagine trying to sprint out of a city while pregnant or nursing a baby. These are very real, tangible impediments to a rapid evacuation.
And as you might guess, the source material views these physical delays as grave spiritual warnings. Just as winter or pregnancy would seriously hinder your chances of escaping a besieged city, these verses are interpreted as a stark warning against delaying your spiritual new birth before the end-time tribulation shows up. The core takeaway: you definitely do not want to be caught in a vulnerable, unprepared spiritual state when the time of massive trouble finally kicks off.
Section 5. The Great Tribulation.
The scripture then culminates with a massive, frankly terrifying warning of a great tribulation. The text describes this event as something completely unprecedented in all of human history. I mean, the stakes are raised to the absolute maximum here. It says nothing before it and literally nothing after it will ever even come close to the severity of this distress.
The source specifically interprets this Great Tribulation as the final 1 times 7 times period that leads directly to the day of the Lord. It's characterized as this intense window of distress and absolute global chaos, and according to the text, this is the ultimate future reality that the 70 AD escape was foreshadowing all along.
There should no flesh be saved. Talk about a terrifying threat to human survival, right from the text. This entire high-stakes apocalyptic scenario stems completely from just one intensely specific sentence, Matthew 24:22. Okay, let's dive into this. It's massive if-then logic. If days aren't shortened, zero survival. If shortened, salvation. But look at this promised rescue mechanic. It's a dramatic cosmic intervention designed specifically for the elect. The source actually frames this verse as a literal prophetic shadow of specific things to come. And it gives us a highly specific, honestly terrifying timeline for this event. Exactly 3.5 years. And this brilliantly illustrates how the text maps out the precise, relentless duration of the end-time tribulation. We see a strict chronological chain. Extreme tribulation ignites intense warfare, marching steadily toward one single final destination. Armageddon, the ultimate terrifying climax of this entire prophecy, lands exactly here. Matthew chapter 24, verse 23, literally zeroes right in on the exact moment this massive deception starts. You know, people arbitrarily pointing and claiming, look, Christ is physically right here, or he's over there. But the scriptural command here? It's totally uncompromising. No gray area at all. Just believe it not. So what is the actual nature of this coming deception? Like, how does it play out? Well, this ultimate trick relies heavily on folks claiming they've witnessed actual physical appearances of Christ. And here's the kicker. These fake appearances will be wildly persuasive because they involve actual performed miracles. Behold, I have told you before. Okay, let's dive into this. What's the actual fundamental purpose of a prophetic message? Think about a herald. They aren't just speakers, right? They deliver urgent warnings of what's coming. And there's immense thematic weight resting entirely on those 7 simple, urgent words. Take the word behold. It's a command. It demands your absolute unwavering attention instantly. Then comes told you before. That phrase really highlights the profound delivery of prophetic foresight. It literally shifts your timeline from extreme vulnerability to complete foretold security. So it creates a clear sequence. The herald speaks, the warning is received, the future unfolds. Every single word acts like a gear, perfectly constructing this undeniable, flawless warning mechanism. The difference is striking. Being told before completely transforms you from totally unready to fully armed. Let's dive right into the fascinating, split nature of the Son of Man's arrival. So, how do you expect this highly anticipated event to actually go down? The answer is pretty surprising. First, you get these hushed rumors, people secretly claiming, hey, he's out in the desert. Notice the places they claim, the remote desert or locked in secret chambers. Super isolated, right? But guys, these are false Christs. These deceptive, localized pop-ups will actually happen before the real deal. The text hits us with a punchy command. Believe it not, just utterly reject those sketchy rumors. Then, bam, the imagery totally flips. For as the lightning cometh out of the east, and shineth even unto the west, it paints a picture of absolute, undeniable visibility everywhere. This lightning metaphor means one specific thing. It'll be totally sudden, taking the world completely by surprise. So shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. That massive, sudden flash is his real arrival. It's a huge contrast. Localized deception, hiding in dark rooms, versus the sudden, shocking reality of lightning. For wheresoever the carcass is, there will the eagles be gathered together. Okay, let's dive into this. It isn't just morbid imagery, it's an unbreakable equation of cause and effect. Look at the variables here. We've got the grounded, lifeless carcass and the highly mobile eagles. The key is the action. There's this unavoidable magnetic pull drawing these two literal elements together. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the spiritual translation. That carcass, it represents spiritual death and wickedness. And those eagles map perfectly to the unseen powers of darkness, which are inevitably drawn to that decay. So, the crucial point is this absolute progression. Where spiritual death occurs, darkness will literally gather. The ultimate takeaway, it brilliantly illustrates the absolute magnetism between spiritual decay and the gathering darkness.
Matthew chapter 24, verse 29. Notice how this scripture specifically calls out wild, highly visual cosmic disruptions happening up in our skies.
But how does the author actually map these ancient warnings of darkness to real future dates?
Well, the proposed timeline jumps ahead, zooming in on astronomical events in 2032 and 2033.
The source claims this exact window features a blood moon tetrad. That's 4 consecutive lunar eclipses.
The author literally connects that ancient prophecy of a moon losing its light to this specific tetrad.
Okay, but what about the other half of that prophecy? The part about a fully darkened sun?
To explain that, the source points us to a very specific date, March 30th, 2033.
Because on that exact day, a total solar eclipse is predicted to sweep across our skies.
The author makes a literal direct match between the darkened sun prophecy and this very eclipse.
Now, the author doesn't just look forward. They actually anchor these astronomical predictions deep in history. They find this historical anchor exactly 2 millennia earlier, right in the year 33 AD.
The text explicitly links our future skies to the historical crucifixion darkness of 33 AD.
This creates a fascinating parallel, spanning exactly 2,000 years from the crucifixion to these modern eclipses.
So, the theory weaves ancient text, modern astronomy, and historical darkness into one perfectly unified timeline.
The second coming of Christ. It's fascinating how it bridges that ancient, vivid cloud imagery right into the specific theological concept. Suddenly, a massive cosmic trumpet blasts. This huge sound sends angels surging straight out into the skies. Their mission? A worldwide gathering of his elect, literally sweeping across the earth from every single direction. The sheer scale here is breathtaking. This angelic dragnet spans from one end of heaven to the other. Now, what's genuinely fascinating is how the source specifically interprets this massive gathering of the elect. It defines them as the spiritual firstborn. That's a direct callback to the worldwide harvest in Revelation 14. The fig tree generation and the 70-year countdown. This is where we see exactly how the author links ancient scripture directly to modern political history. To understand this timeline, we first have to figure out the unit of measurement being used. According to the source's framework, a generation is defined as precisely 70 years. The text argues that this 70-year block represents a specific period of time given by God as a chance to repent.
And to back this up, the author mirrors this number with the 70 years of the Babylonian exile that you find in the Old Testament. So the rule is, whenever the text refers to a generation, we need to plug in the number 70. Now here's where the math hits the modern era. The timeline anchors itself on two massive historical events. First, the UN resolution for Israel to become a nation in 1947, and second, the actual Israeli Declaration of Independence in 1948. The author mathematically projects 70 years forward from both of these dates. So 1947 plus 70 brings us to the year 2017, which corresponds to the Hebrew year 5777. And 1948 plus 70 brings us to 2018, or the Hebrew year 578. Suddenly, 2017 and 2018 become highly significant target years in this prophetic geometry. But wait, the author doesn't just treat 70 as a simple measure of time. There is a much deeper symbolic weight placed on this number. You see, in the Hebrew alphabet, letters also carry numerical values. The number 70 is the numeric value of the 16th Hebrew letter ayin. And what does ayin represent? Well, according to the text, it symbolizes God's eye looking upon the earth. The author then explicitly links this concept to the days of Noah, right before the Great Flood, citing Genesis chapter 6. So in the author's eyes, this 70-year timeline isn't just a countdown, it's a period of divine observation right before potential destruction. Moving on to Section 2, Unlocking the Jubilee Codes and Intersecting Cycles. Okay, if the 70-year generation was the foundation, things are about to get a whole lot more layered. The author starts stacking different historical intervals, specifically 50-year, 70-year, and 500-year periods to create this massive convergence point. Check out this pattern. 1917 marked both the Siege of Jerusalem and 500 years since Martin Luther seceded from the papacy. The text actually calls this a 500-year Great Jubilee Code. Then, 1947 is the UN resolution, which kicks off our 70-year Last Generation Code. Fast forward to 1967, the Six-Day War, which the text views as representing 6,000 years of warfare. From 1967, we add a 50-year Jubilee Code. So what happens when you project all these codes forward? 500 years from 1517, 100 years from 1917, 70 years from 1947, and 50 years from 1967, they all converge perfectly on the exact same year, 2017. Because of this massive historical alignment, the source arrives at a pretty definitive conclusion. 2017 is declared to be God's clock to the day of the Lord counted. It becomes the absolute focal point of all these intersecting historical cycles. Every major prophetic timer, according to the author, ran out in 2017. And to really cement this year into their prophetic geometry, the author applies a numerological technique. The text claims that the number 2017 is a composite number of 2368. Now, why does that matter? Well, because in Greek numerology, 2368 is the exact numerical value of the name Jesus Christ. For the author, this absolutely isn't a coincidence. It's seen as mathematical proof that the year 2017 is marked by divine design. Section 3, Cosmic Signs in 2017, Astronomical Anomalies. Now, the text shifts its focus from earthly geopolitics right up into the skies, incorporating actual astronomical events into its mathematical tapestry. The author points to a very specific, real-world event, the total solar eclipse that crossed the United States on August 21, 2017. While astronomers view eclipses as just predictable orbital mechanics, our source interprets this specific eclipse as a literal cosmic message. The text calls it a message of both liberation and destruction of the wicked. But the author doesn't stop at symbolism. They apply math to the eclipse itself. Now, this is where it gets really fascinating. Let's walk through how the author reverse engineers geographic data to fit their timeline. It's some pretty mind-bending math. Step 1. The author takes the specific geographical coordinates of that 2017 eclipse, which were 37.5 degrees north and 88.8 degrees west. Step 2. They multiply those two coordinates together. So 37.5 times 88.8 equals 3330. Step 3, the author takes that result, 3330, and adds it to the Hebrew calendar year of Moses' Passover, which happens to be 2448. Step 4, 3330 plus 2448 equals 5778. Remember that number from earlier? 5778 is the Hebrew year corresponding to 2018 AD, which is exactly 70 years from Israeli independence. The author is literally using geographical coordinates to mathematically validate their generation timeline. The author also plays around with the symmetry of the Hebrew years. Take the Hebrew year for 2017, which is 5777. The author flips this number around to create a palindrome, 7775. In the source material, 5777 is labeled the destruction code, while its mirror, 7775, is labeled the ark rest code. Once again, the author is directly connecting modern dates to the Genesis flood narrative, contrasting the destruction of the world with the safety found in Noah's ark.
And finally, Section 4, the mathematics of Armageddon, the ultimate equation.
Brace yourselves because we are moving into pure esoteric mathematics here. This is where we see the most complex escalation of the author's numerology. The author takes our target Hebrew year, 5778, and starts looking for it absolutely everywhere. First, they calculate the numeric value of the biblical verse, Matthew 4:17, which reads, "The kingdom of heaven is at hand." And according to the source, the value of that verse is exactly 5778. Then they look to astrophysics. The text points out that the surface temperature of the sun is often cited as 5778 degrees Kelvin. The author uses the sun as the sign of seasons, days, and years, arguing that the sun itself is permanently broadcasting the year of the end times. I mean, it really illustrates the sheer incredible scope of the author's pattern matching. But hold on, because the math goes to an entirely different level here. The author now runs the number 5778 through a really complex sequence. Let me carefully walk you through this. Step 1. The author finds the prime number of 5778, which is 56,963. Step 2. They search for the very first occurrence of that exact string of numbers, 56963, within the infinite decimal sequence of pi. Step 3. Once they find where 56963 first appears in pi, they extract the 3 digits immediately preceding it and the 3 digits immediately following it. Those surrounding numbers happen to be 977 and 031. Step 4. The author adds those two surrounding numbers together. 977 plus 031 equals exactly 1008. So why? Why go through all that incredibly specific math with the sequence of pi just to arrive at the number 1008? Well, it all comes down to gematria. Like we talked about earlier, gematria is an ancient practice of assigning numerical values to letters and words. According to the text, if you calculate the Greek gematria of the word Armageddon, the result is exactly 1008. So the author is arguing that embedded right within the mathematical constant of pi, surrounding the prime number of the Hebrew year 5778, is the mathematical signature of Armageddon. And really, this perfectly illustrates the ultimate destination of the author's prophetic geometry. Every single calculation, from the 70-year generation starting in 1947, to the Jubilee codes, to the solar eclipse coordinates, and finally the extraction of numbers from pi, it all leads the author straight to Revelation 16:16, the gathering at the place of destruction, Armageddon. The text uses an astonishing array of completely separate data points just to build a bridge to this single apocalyptic conclusion. Right off the bat, there's a massive mystery. The exact timeline, nobody knows. It's totally hidden. It's going to arrive like a thief, meaning zero warning, just sudden, stealthy, and completely unexpected. To explain this crazy suddenness, the text actually points right back to the historical days of Noah.
That ancient era is a huge prophetic sign for us, cryptically marked down as 717-7775.
It paints a picture of folks just living life, eating, drinking, getting married, totally distracted.
But this everyday distraction isn't just innocent routine. The prophecy calls it dangerous carnality and godlessness. In fact, this dangerous state of being obsessed with worldly stuff, it's labeled the 666 message. So what's the big takeaway? People were completely clueless until the flood actually hit. Wild, right? Now, check out this pattern. Everything revolves around a super specific timeline based on the number 7. Think about it. Exactly 7 days passed from when Noah entered the ark until the waters came. And that historical 7-day wait, it perfectly mirrors the prophecy's warning of 7 years of tribulation. All these numbers are building up to the prophecy's absolute climax, the end-time final separation. Picture this, 2 people working side by side in a field or grinding at a mill, just doing their jobs. Then, boom, in a split second, one is taken away and the other is just left behind. Because the split happened so fast, the text gives us one urgent, massive command. Watch, therefore.
You literally have to stay on guard constantly. Why? Because the exact day is a total mystery. Which leaves us with this heavy question. If the end arrives like a thief, how do we prepare? So, I want you to just think about this question for a second. If you absolutely knew, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that a thief was coming to break into your house tonight, what would you actually do? You definitely wouldn't just leave a key under the mat and casually go to sleep, right? No way. You'd lock the doors, you'd probably stay up all night, you'd be on ultra high alert. And, this is exactly the hook our source text uses to set up its whole premise. It takes something we all instinctively get, protecting our home from a sudden break-in, and uses it to explain the totally unpredictable nature of the day of the Lord. The text is basically demanding that there's an urgent necessity to be ready, precisely because we have no idea when it's actually going to happen. And that brings us right to the opening verse of the text. It reads, "But know this, that if the good man of the house had known in what watch the thief would come, he would have watched and would not have suffered his house to be broken up." Now, good man of the house is just an old school way of saying the homeowner or the head of the family. It sets up this scene of complete sudden surprise. The whole thief in the night metaphor is actually brilliant, right? Because the thief relies 100% on the homeowner being unprepared. By framing it like this, the text puts the entire burden of readiness squarely on the shoulders of the householder. It's all on them. Okay, so what's really fascinating here is how the source text actually interprets this state of readiness. It gives us a very specific definition of what it means to be that prepared householder. Right after the command, "Therefore be ye also ready," the material includes this highly specific condition. It literally states that being ready means being found sealed with seal of the living God, 144,000. So in the context of this specific text, readiness isn't just, a general state of mind. It's tied directly to a very distinct apocalyptic classification. It's about achieving the spiritual state of being sealed with the seal of the living God, numbering 144,000. Which brings us to our first character study, the profile of the vigilant servant. Let's look at exactly what makes this servant so faithful and wise. According to the text, this vigilant servant is defined by some very specific outward actions and responsibilities. First off, this servant is made ruler over his household. That implies a massive amount of trust and authority given by the Lord. Second, their main job is to give them meat in due season. Now, that doesn't just mean throwing food at people whenever. In due season means providing consistent, active, and timely care for everyone else in the house. And third, and this is the really critical part, the servant has to be found actively doing this exact job when the Lord suddenly shows up. Because vigilance isn't just staring out a window waiting. It's actually doing the work right up until the very second of that surprise return. Then, the text lays down a really powerful judgment on this behavior. It says, "Blessed is that servant whom his Lord when he cometh shall find so doing." The absolute key takeaway here is that the blessing isn't for some good deeds they did in the past, or even for just intending to do good things later on. That blessed status is given entirely because the Lord literally finds the servant in the act of doing their job at the exact unpredictable moment he arrives. It's that continuous, uninterrupted action that triggers the blessing. And all of that continuous watchfulness leads to a pretty amazing reward. The text says they are made ruler over all his goods. Just look at the promotion there. I mean, they started out managing just the immediate household staff and the daily food, right? But because they kept up their duty while the Lord was gone, they get handed the keys to the entire estate. It's a huge step up. But we have to remember, this entire text is built on a very strict binary. Just as it clearly defined what the vigilant condition looks like, it goes right ahead and defines its absolute opposite. Where the vigilant servant gets sealed with the seal of God, the text explicitly tags the unprepared, wicked state with another very famous apocalyptic symbol. When it describes the actions of the evil servant, the source text defines this state as being found in the condition sealed with mark of the beast 666. Again, we're just looking at how the source material categorizes things here, and it sets up this ultimate dramatic contrast. It's literally the 144,000 versus the 666. So let's look at the profile of the wicked servant to see exactly how this downfall happens. How does someone end up with that dark of a spiritual classification? Well, the text actually outlines a very specific 3-step downward spiral. And it's interesting because step 1 happens entirely inside their head. The servant shall say in his heart, "My Lord delayeth his coming."
That internal justification, that totally false belief that they have plenty of time, is the catalyst for everything bad that follows. Because he thinks the Lord is delayed, we hit step 2. He shall begin to smite his fellow servants. So that internal complacency quickly turns into external violence. And finally, step 3. He begins to eat and drink with the drunken. He just completely abandons his duty for pure indulgence. It's wild how fast it goes from, hey, I have plenty of time, to physically abusing the staff and partying. It really shows how a lack of watchfulness directly breeds corruption.
And obviously, because he's so distracted, the trap totally springs on him. The text says, "The Lord of that servant shall come in a day when he looketh not for him, and in an hour that he is not aware of." And boom, we are right back to that metaphor of the thief in the night from the very beginning of this explanation. The evil servant's false sense of security is exactly what sets up his devastating downfall. He gets caught completely off guard, utterly failing the big test of vigilance. Let's just pause for a second and look at these two side by side. On one hand, you've got the vigilant servant. They are faithful, actively providing meat in due season, and that results in the condition of being sealed with the 144,000. On the flip side, you have the evil servant. They are abusive, smiting others, indulging with the drunken, and that results in the condition of being sealed with the 666. The text literally leaves zero middle ground here. It's an absolute divergence of paths, and it's based entirely on how a person chooses to act during the unpredictable absence of the Lord. Which brings us to the final reckoning. And as you might guess, things do not end well for the unprepared servant. The specific judgments listed in the verse are incredibly severe, and they are totally final. First, it says the Lord shall cut him asunder, which is a pretty brutal way of indicating complete destruction and separation. Second, he will appoint him his portion with the hypocrites, permanently cementing the servant's spiritual exile right alongside the deceitful. And finally, the text wraps up with that famous heavy phrase, "There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth." It represents ultimate sorrow, regret, and just pure agony. It is a complete and total separation on the day of the Lord. So what's the big takeaway from all of this? Well, the source text leaves us with a pretty profound ultimatum. It completely strips away any room to be complacent, taking this everyday idea of a thief breaking in and linking it to ultimate cosmic stakes. So it really all comes down to this final challenge from the material. In the sudden, completely unpredictable hour of the Lord's return, which condition will you be found in?